For the last activity, you have to recall what you learned from your week 10 lesson in the second quarter, which is about proving. A two-column proof consists of the statements and the reasons. The statement column is where you write all the valid conclusions derived from the given information. And the reasons list down the different definitions, postulates, properties, and theorems to support your conclusion. Always remember that our first row starts with the given information. Babalikan nyo lang yung binigay dito, kung ano yung given. And the succeeding rows, yung mga sumunod, list down the other conclusions derived from the preceding statements form, and they must be supported by valid reasons like definitions, theorems, postulates, and properties. Finally, our last row is where you can see what to prove, kung ano yung ipuprove nyo, which must be supported by your reason under the second column. So, yun yung mga kailangan nyong matandaan in proving using a two-column proof. So, let's have the second activity, which is entitled, Give Me Reasons That We Are Congruent. We have to prove the following. We have the given, and the figure, and the statement to prove. So, based from the figure, it was stated that Wx, this side, is congruent to side Yx or xy. And it was already given that Z is the midpoint of Wy. And what we need to prove is that the two triangles WXZ, this triangle, is congruent to triangle YXZ. Now let's start with the first statement. What do we write here? So I mentioned earlier that the first row must always start with the given information. What was given? Wx is congruent to Yx. And there's another given information, right? So let's write it in number 2. It was stated from the given that Z is the midpoint of Wy. What reason? It's the given. Now, to make the third conclusion, you have to go back with the second and the first statement. The second statement states that Z is the midpoint of Wy. This is the midpoint, Z. And we know, according to the definition of midpoint, that a midpoint is a point that divides a line or a segment into two congruent parts. Since C is the midpoint, we can conclude that WZ is congruent to ZY. And what is the valid reason? Definition of midpoint. Because according to the definition of midpoint, a midpoint is a point that divides a segment into two congruent parts. Can you follow? Now, what to write in number 4? Number 4, it was already written that XZ is congruent to XZ. Looking back at the figure, we can see that the two triangles share a common side xz. And what theorem, definition, postulate, or property supports this conclusion? xz is congruent to xc through reflexive property, because this reflexive property states that a number a is always equal to itself, a. Now, since number 5 is the last column, and I said earlier that the last row is where you can see what to prove. You have to prove the triangle WXZ is congruent to YXZ. But it must be supported by a reason under the second column. For what reason? Since the first corresponding side, WX and YX are congruent, the second corresponding sides, WZ and ZY, and the third corresponding side, XZ, is congruent to XC. Now, since the three corresponding sides of the two triangles are congruent, the two triangles are congruent by SSS, or side-side-side congruence. As easy as that. Just have to take note of the different rows of this column. Now let's have number 2. Based from the figure, it was given that triangle KLM is isosceles, and LP, this side, bisects angle L, this angle. We have to prove that triangle KLP is congruent to triangle PLM. So again, the first row starts with the given information. Triangle KLM is isosceles, and that is your given. That's what you write in the reason column. Another given is that LP bisects angle L. That's what you write in number 2 under the statements column. For what reason? It's the given. Next, KL is congruent to LM. Going back to the figure, KL is congruent to LM. What is the valid reason for this? Since it was stated from the given that this triangle KLM is isosceles, the two sides must be congruent, right? And those sides are KL and ML. Therefore, KL is congruent to ML according to the definition of isosceles triangle. Because isosceles triangle is defined as a triangle having at least two congruent sides. Now for number 4, let's use the second statement. LP bisects angle L. Side LP bisects this big angle KLM, or angle L. What valid conclusion can be derived from the statement? Based from the definition of an angle bisector is the segment that divides an angle into two congruent smaller angles. So once LP bisects angle L, we form two congruent smaller angles here. And what are those angles? We have angle KLP and angle PLM. They are congruent according to the definition of angle bisector. Seeing the figure alone, we can see that the two triangles share a common side, or there is an overlapping side. LP is congruent to side LP, which is supported by what? Valid reason. Reflexive property. And last thing is that our last row is where we see what to prove. Triangle KLP is congruent to triangle PLM. Supported by what specific reason? Now, it was stated from the preceding statements under this column that KL is congruent to LM. So one of the corresponding sides of the two triangles are congruent. And one angle is also congruent. Another corresponding sides are congruent. And this angle, KLP and PLM, are the included angles. Therefore, the two triangles are congruent using side, angle, side congruence. That's it. I hope you learned something from this discussion. This virtual instruction wouldn't be possible without the concerted efforts of the grade 8 team members. Sir Manny C. Ancheta, Ma'am Reyna S. Corpus, Ma'am Ophelia B. Mapata, Ma'am Rowena B. Palaming, Ma'am Mary Grace C. Talbo, and yours truly, Paula Bianca P. Cruz. See you on the next discussion.